Hello and welcome to everyone on the line. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Are Grantees Using Foundation's Social Media? My name is Ellie Buteau. I'm the Vice President for Research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. I'll start off with a very brief introduction to CEP, and then we'll move into discussing our research on social media. My colleague and co-author, Andrea Brock, will share a bit about our methodology and describe our findings. Andrea is a research manager at CEP. She leads research projects focused on foundation grantee relationships and performance assessment. When we set out to do this research, we knew that it would raise more questions than it could answer. So a goal of releasing this research was to contribute data to conversations that are happening about social media at foundations. In that vein, we are delighted to have Elizabeth Miller from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation on the line. Elizabeth is a communications associate at the Knight Foundation. Prior to being at Knight, she worked for the Overbrook Foundation and helped that foundation increase its social media presence. Today, Elizabeth will be sharing her reaction to the research findings and explain how and to what end the Knight Foundation uses social media. We're very pleased to also have Bruce Trachtenberg on this call. Bruce has been the Executive Director of the Communications Network since 2006. Prior to that, he was Director of Communications at the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation, and Bruce has years of relevant experience as a communications expert. We look forward to hearing his reaction to the research findings and his perspective about how to approach social media as a communications tool. On your computer screen, you should see a question pane. In using that pane, you can submit questions throughout this webinar. We will try to get to as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A session at the end. I want to briefly share a little bit of information about the Center for Effective Philanthropy as background for why we did this research on social media. CEP is 11 years old, and our mission is to provide data that will lead to insight so funders can better define effectiveness and assess and improve their effectiveness. Our main audience is foundations, and we hope that as a result of either reading our research or engaging with our tools or communications, foundations will ultimately be able to have more impact through the work that they do. All of our research is grant funded, and the research we're discussing today was supported by a project support grant from the Rita Allen Foundation. Many of our other major funders shown here on the slide provide operating support that fuels our research efforts. Through CEP's research, we want to provide timely data on issues that are of interest to foundations now. And social media is just that, a topic that a number of foundations have been thinking about and many have been engaging with. Modes of communication continue to evolve, and some people are getting quite a bit of their information these days from Twitter and blogs, and they follow their friends, their colleagues, and organizations they care about on Facebook to keep up on what's new. And as we mentioned in the paper, the number of examples of social media being used to spur social change is continuing to grow. So the question we wanted to answer through this research is a very basic one. Are grantees using their foundation funders' social media resources? We fully do recognize that not all foundations using social media have a goal of reaching their grantees through their social media. Though in the pre-webinar survey that many of you on the line recently completed, many of you did indicate that grantees are a main audience for your social media efforts. But even among foundations trying to reach grantees through social media, those foundations may have different goals for those efforts. Some might want to interact with grantees through their social media, while others may simply want to share information with their grantees. In this research, we don't address different goals foundations might have for their social media, but instead are focused on whether or not their grantees are paying attention to their social media efforts. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague and co-author, Andrea, to share a bit about our methodology and discuss our research findings.
Great, thank you, Ellie. I'm sure many of you on the call have read the report, and so I will just be quickly sharing interesting findings and data points from our research. In 2011, we surveyed more than 6,000 grantees of one of 34 foundations included in this research. These 34 foundations had a median asset size of $370 million, and the typical foundation is giving $17 million a year. The more than 6,000 grantee organizations had a median annual operating budget of $1.3 million, and the grantee respondents held various leadership titles. 40% are executive director or CEO of their organization, 20% were program directors, and 14% held other senior leadership titles. The survey we sent to grantees explored many dimensions of foundation performance, ranging from relationships with grantees to grantee perceptions of foundations' impact on their organizations, fields, or communities. We have 5 questions in this survey related to grantees' use and experience with funder social media. And by social media, I mean these 4 specific tools: the blogs, Facebook, Twitter, and video sharing sites such as YouTube. Also, the survey questions asked about use of social media, so whether or not grantees were using social media created by their funder or its staff. Of course, use can mean many things, ranging from reading or following funders' social media to engaging with them. And so, as Ellie already mentioned, we sought out to answer the question, are grantees using their funders' social media? So what did our research find? First, that the majority of foundations have social media tools that they're using to communicate about their work. However, very few grantees are accessing these resources. And those that are finding it to be less helpful than other communication resources foundations provide them. Going a little bit more in depth. As you can see, 68% of the foundations included in this research have posted videos. It is the most widely embraced medium by foundations. More than half have a Twitter or Facebook account, and 29% have a blog. Slightly more than half of the 34 foundations have adopted at least 3 of these 4 tools. Overall, 71% of foundations are producers of at least one of these 4 social media tools we examined in this research. Of the foundations that have these tools, the frequency of use varied considerably across the foundations. We looked at a 3-month period before the close of the grantee survey and found that some funders were heavy users while others hardly used them. And this variation existed across all 4 of the social media tools we examined. So now that we know that foundations have social media, the question becomes, are grantees paying attention? Despite the availability of funders' social media, few grantees are accessing these resources. Only 16% of grantees report using social media created by their funder or its staff. 52% report using no social media tools, and almost 1/3 of grantees don't even know whether their funder or its staff has any of the social media available. More specifically, you can see how few grantees are following their funders on Facebook or Twitter, reading blogs by their funder or its staff, or watching funder videos. Grantees are most commonly accessing funders' Facebook pages, but only 10% of grantees report doing so. Fewer grantees are engaging with their funders through blogs, videos, and Twitter. This raises the question, why are grantees not using foundation funders' social media? One explanation could be that grantees simply are not interested in using funders' social media. However, as you can see, there are grantees in this research who are not using their funders or staff social media, but report wanting to. For example, 51% of grantees report they would watch their funders' videos if their funder made videos available. And in fact, many of those funders do have videos. As I previously shared, videos is the most common social media tool among foundations in this research. Most of the grantees that said they would use their funders' video, Facebook, or Twitter resources were responding about funders that we found to have those resources already available. Another explanation for why grantees are not using their funders' social media could be that grantee organizations lack familiarity or comfort with these tools. However, we found that the majority of grantee organizations included in this research report using social media at their own organizations to communicate about their work. On average, grantee organizations have between 2 and 3 types of social media tools, and Facebook is the most widely used resource. And this picture holds true for all the 34 foundations in this research. The typical foundation has 80% of their grantees using social media to communicate about their own work. And so while our data doesn't support either of these explanations fully, Elizabeth and Bruce, who will share their perspectives later, might have additional thoughts on the question why grantees are not engaging with their funders through their funders' social media. Also, some of you on the call might have ideas about this as well. Please share them during the Q&A. So shifting the focus to those grantees who are actually accessing their funders' social media, we found that social media is not seen by grantees to be as helpful as other communication resources. This chart shows average helpfulness ratings on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is indicating that the resource is not at all helpful, and 7 indicates that the resource is extremely helpful. Grantees find social media to be less helpful for learning about the foundation than individual communications, group meetings with foundation staff, foundations published funding guidelines, and foundation's website. The greatest difference exists between individual communication and group meetings and social media. However, there are other ways that social media can be helpful, not just for learning about the foundation generally. Although other uses for social media do not fare much better when respondents when it comes to helpfulness. For example, grantees on average rated a 4.3 for how helpful social media is for interacting and sharing ideas with the foundation. This is one of the lowest rated items in our survey. And so I'm going to stop there and just quickly review what we found through this research is that the majority of foundations have social media, yet very few grantees are accessing these resources, and those that are finding it to be less helpful than other communication resources the foundation provides. And I'll turn it back over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Andrea. Andrea, one question that we received from a few people on the line that I want to ask you to answer before we move on to Elizabeth is, what do you mean when you say grantees are using or not using their funders' social media tools?
Great. And so the question asked specifically if the grantee was using their funders' social media. We didn't go more specifically about whether or not, in what ways they use it, whether or not they're just reading it or if they're engaging with it. And so unfortunately, I can't really fully answer that question. Maybe perhaps Bruce or Elizabeth have thoughts on how, especially at the Knight Foundation, how grantees use their social media.
Thank you. So next we're going to hear a foundation perspective from Elizabeth Miller from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Elizabeth, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Hi, everyone. I first just want to say a quick thanks to the Center for Effective Philanthropy for organizing this webinar. I think it's really great that they've sort of taken a leadership role in examining how foundations and their grantees are interacting with social media. And also to say hi to my colleague Bruce and also say that I'm thankful for his leadership and sort of dedication to strengthening foundation communications generally. So, you know, my initial reaction to this report, I was first pleased to see that the majority of foundations do and are using social media tools, especially the high use of video, and that foundations are experimenting on Facebook and Twitter. The one thing that did surprise me was that there was a lower adoption rate of foundations using blogs. And I found that really interesting because our strategy at Knight Foundation is very much to drive our online communication through our blogs. We find that it's a primary tool for us to do a lot of different things, to be open and transparent about what we're funding, to talk about our current grantees and partners, to look for new ideas, and then we're able to sort of use the content that we've created for our blog and deploy them through different social media channels, which allows us to interact with our networks. So, for us, really, social media comes down to content and relationship building, and we feel like our blog is a really central way that we're able to do that. And sort of building off that, at Knight Foundation, our social media strategy and what we do doesn't really sit as an outlier from the rest of our communication goals. We really use it as an opportunity to extend the work that we're already doing around communications, whether it's through the use of things like press releases or traditional communication strategies. But we don't do anything differently on social media than we do, whether it's a program officer talking to somebody offline. We really try to stay authentic to who we are and to what we're doing. And I think that key to that really is sort of figuring out what your goals are and what you're trying to do. I feel like a lot of foundations that I've talked with feel like they need to be all things to all people. And I think success will really come from defining what your goals are and who your audiences are, and knowing where they are online and how you can reach them. Are they using one type of social media more than another? And I think at Knight, one of our biggest successes in terms of interacting with folks has been on Twitter, because we fund a lot of projects and ideas around journalism and media innovation, and that's where those folks live. They live on Twitter. They're on Google+, they're on Facebook all the time. So it's a really good opportunity for us to interact with them. Maybe if you're funding in the arts, you'll see your grantees are more active on Pinterest or Instagram or some other sort of more visual medium. But I think the thing to remember is that you don't have to do everything all at once. You really should make strategic choices based on who you're trying to reach and how you think you can reach them. And also what they're using social media for and how you can interact with them on it. And building off the theme of interaction, social media is really a two-way street. And I think that some grantees who feel like they're not interacting with their foundation social media is because it may not be consistent. So, you want to not only share your own information, but you want to give feedback. You want to interact with people. You want to have some value to what your social media strategy is. You don't just want to push things out and only use it to share your own information, but to make sure you're sharing what you're doing with other people and leveraging your assets as a foundation to help support your own partners and your own networks. And that takes time and that takes resources. But I think once grantees start to see sort of a real dedication to social media, they will come to you. And I think we at Knight saw that particularly with our ability to answer questions on Twitter related to our news challenge. And so we had people available on Twitter to answer questions about the grant application process, about problems with their applications not going through, and it was a really good way actually for us to provide additional support to the program team who didn't have to answer every phone call or every email that came in. We were able to sort of field questions on their behalf and loop people in when we needed to. We also used Google Plus Hangouts to provide like face-to-face office hours with program people, so that people who are interested in submitting ideas or had questions were able to sort of see the people behind the foundation, and it wasn't just sending a question to an email box, and we had a lot of success and good feedback from that. And really sort of one of the key things is that Knight's very lucky in that we have sort of a buy-in from all levels of staff and our board and our CEO about the importance of social media. And so we were able to do things like if an individual has a personal Twitter account, we linked it to their staff page. I think sometimes funders say, well, I didn't know that my program officer had Twitter. Well, if you put it on their staff page, they're going to know. And one of our highest trafficked pages, if you look at Knight Foundation's website over the course of the year, is a staff page. So sometimes it can be just as simple as integrating something like that to let grantees know, hey, we are on social media, we are active, these are the places that we're sharing content, and these are the opportunities where we want to learn from you, can go a long way. And I think the other thing, too, is sort of as you're assessing what you're doing, it's really important to take the time to measure how successful you are. I feel like more than half of the things that Knight does, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, sort of don't get a high level of interaction or engagement. So we look for outliers, and we look we try to see, hey, why did that post get shared so many more times, or why did this tweet that we sent out gather all these responses and comments, or it started a conversation, and really look and say, was it the type of content, was it the time of day that we did it, what about that made it a success? And that really helps us in our approach figure out what we want to do more of and where our grantees find value. And the key thing to remember is you don't want to be doing something on social media if you feel like your grantees aren't getting anything out of it, because yes, your grantees are a big audience, but so are your potential grantees, so are other funders in the field who you consider peers. It's just sort of a good knowledge building tool. And sort of the last thing I want to say before I turn it over to Bruce is really that, for Knight Foundation, our use of social media is really about building networks and amplifying the voices of who we're supporting and why we're doing it. But really, this is also about sort of social innovation and social change and entrepreneurship. Young people and emerging generations are on social media all the time. And so if you want to reach those people, it's really important that you're on social media and that you're active and that you're not just using it as a one-way method of communication, because sort of the next generation of social change, and whether you're funding in health or arts or journalism, there are young people and there are people doing great work on social media, and you can be part of the conversation, and that's sort of how Knight Foundation thinks of it. So I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. I'm happy to take questions later or address challenges. I'm also happy to talk about specific tools that Knight uses if that's helpful for people. But again, just want to thank Center for Effective Philanthropy for organizing this, and look forward to talking more with people.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Next, we'll hear from Bruce Trachtenberg, Executive Director of the Communications Network. Bruce? Bruce, are you there? Okay, I think while we see what happened to Bruce, Elizabeth, have a number of questions for you that have come in already.
Great.
One person on the line recognized that social media can be a flat and open channel for communication. Can you say anything about how the Knight Foundation has taken into account the power dynamics that are inherent in the funder-grantee relationship through its use of social media?
Sure. That's something that we're very aware of. I think, one of the other ways that we sort of use social media is as this sort of listening device, because we care what people are saying about us. And not everything that people say on social media about Knight Foundation is really nice. I wish it were. But so, there is definitely a level of people who sort of use social media to get our attention. So they'll, start adding us, or they'll send us direct messages because they sort of, they know that we're paying attention and they know that we're listening. And so I think you have to take it with a grain of salt. I think it's part of being a foundation and being open and transparent and saying, this is what we are and this is what we do, and we want to listen to people, but that sort of just comes with the territory. But on the flip side, what I think is a really good opportunity is that there have been so many times when we have done a Q&A with a grantee for a blog post, or we've tweeted about an event that they've had, and people come back and say, that was so great that you did that. We had 100 more people register for this event, or we took that video you made to another funder who is now interested. So I think it works both ways.
Thank you. A follow-up question to that is, Elizabeth, how is the Knight Foundation measuring engagement with social media?
So we do it both sort of formally and informally. When we use analytics, we're using a variety of analytics to sort of measure how we do. On our blog and our website, we use Google Analytics. There are also, to track Twitter, we use a bit.ly shortened link so we can see, how many people are clicking on links, how many mentions are we getting per day, how many people are retweeting stuff that we've sent out, So we have hard numbers, but then to a certain extent, some of it's anecdotal. We'll say, hey, did you see that person tweeted the evaluation we just did about social impact games, and this is what they said about it. And then, we looped in our evaluation team who started tweeting with them, and then they started this whole conversation. So we do it both, with analytics and informally. And it's been, and with Facebook Insights too, we sort of see, we're tracking our reach and seeing what kinds of content are people sharing, how often are they sharing it, how often are they commenting, how often does our stuff get, pop up on something like Pinterest from other places where other people have taken our content and shared it.
Great, thanks, Elizabeth.
Of course.
A couple of questions here directed to CEP. Andrea, I'm going to ask you to share with the group. This person wants to know, was CEP surprised by the results of the survey, and what are the reactions that we're hearing? Are foundations surprised or disappointed by these results?
I think what we definitely wanted, we were definitely interested in this topic. Social media is very popular and is talked about a lot today. I don't know if we were necessarily surprised by the research. I think we're happy now that we have some data to be able to add to the conversation. And in terms of if other grant makers or others outside of CEP, in terms of those general reactions, I would say, really good resources as to go to our blog. We've been having some great conversations on our blog from those outside of CEP commenting on our findings. I think overall, it doesn't seem like many people are all that surprised.
Another question for you, Andrea. Someone wants to have a better understanding of how diverse were the 34 foundations included in this study.
Great. And so I already shared some median values of assets and giving. I would say that of the 34 foundations, they're mostly foundations that are giving at least $5 million a year annually. And in terms of the diversity, they are mostly private, independent foundations, although we do have family foundations, community foundations included in this group as well.
Thank you. Bruce, are you on the line with us now?
I certainly hope so.
Excellent. Yes, we can hear you. Okay. Take it away, Bruce.
I mean, you're going to think I set this all up because we're having a conversation about can you hear me? I mean, we're talking about people talking and not being heard. And it kind of reminds you because I was talking and not getting a response. Before I got on this call, somebody said, hey, it's kind of like being the only person with a walkie-talkie. So here I am. I want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for letting me join back in again. And what I started to say earlier, as I was sort of disappointed that I had to follow Elizabeth, it makes me want to start over and throw everything I had to say and begin again because she brought so much interesting perspective from a foundation that's effectively using social media. And the way that kind of does bring up one of the points I wanted to start with is that this is not a study of social media overall. It's a study of a very narrow slice among a very narrow audience. And it's looking at how they're consuming a potential certain kind of message. And we're not even looking at necessarily what foundations are using social media for, but making some assumptions that grantees and target audiences. This is kind of why I liked where Elizabeth started and brought much of her focus to, which is as a foundation, it really doesn't matter what medium or what channel you're using. What matters is what you're trying to accomplish as an organization overall and how your communication strategy supports that. And I'm someone who started in communications when it was all print-based, which means producing documents in some kind of physical form and mailing them around, hand delivering them. You had a pretty good idea they would get where they're going because if you handed it to somebody or if you walked into their office or if you sent it by mail, it got there. At least you got some recognition. Now we're living in a world where things go out in great volume, but it isn't as easy to target as you can if you have a very specific mailing list even for an email. But when you're doing things on a mass scale, whether you're blogging and you can link to it from your website or RSS, or if you're tweeting or you're on a Facebook page, yes, you can see people clicking through, you can measure certain kind of activity, but you're not necessarily knowing the level of usage. So I really have to applaud Center for Effective Philanthropy for at least giving us some measure that tells us a very crucial audience, the foundation in their communications, is not interacting at one level, and that's the social media. But I also was very pleased when I read the report that there are things that foundations are doing well. Those slides that were shown earlier about what is helpful that's really, really important information, because it would have been extremely disappointing to see that grantees are not paying attention to social media, nor are they using other pieces of information that foundations are sharing. So I think we have to look at that and say, in this world in which the way people communicate, things are changing so rapidly, it is actually somewhat reassuring to know that something is working, and with some certainty. That doesn't mean that over time, and from some of the things that Elizabeth talked about, by being more strategic in how we use social media, the level of usage and engagement won't increase. So I think we just have to make a recognition that we have some information that tells us about a tool that isn't working in perhaps a way that some foundations wish it would work more, but I don't even know that we can make that as a blanket statement. I mean, I don't know, and we don't know, unless we talk to every foundation that's using social media, who are the audiences that they're trying to reach. Yes, I'm sure it's implicit that grantees are an important audience, but is that an absolute audience? Is it a minor audience? I mean, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered before we get to there, and that would be certainly a worthwhile second piece of study. The other thing is, I think when it comes to social media, we have to be careful in saying, absolutely, I don't learn about that foundation for their social media. That doesn't mean that somebody else that the grantee relies on as a reliable source isn't seeing the information the foundation is putting out, and maybe taking the information and sending it in an email and saying, wow, you really need to see this from such and such a foundation. Now, they don't know that it came through social media that somebody else saw. So I think we have to be careful making any kind of rash statements that it works or it doesn't work. Also, we just have to accept the fact that the volume of social media is mind-boggling and probably mind-crippling. You know, I get asked frequently as part of surveys, you know, whose social media do you use, whose blogs do you read? And sometimes I have a difficult time remembering because it's just too much of it. It's so much new, and you know, and I get them confused after a while. I think, though, what I try to remember is what were the things that I learned. And I think we've always had this problem of attribution in foundation communications. Is that, you know, I heard something the other day, or I read about it. It was based on a piece of work that somebody did, but I don't always honestly remember what was the original source. So if you think in terms of yourself as a foundation, for any of the foundation folks that are listening out there, and part of your job is informing a larger public about work you're doing, it could be that through social media that information is getting out there, but it may not be attributable may not be attributed to work you did directly, but you are having an effect. So more importantly, what a foundation or anybody needs to do is to survey grantees and the larger universe and say, are our messages being received in general? And again, you can get into the granular and ask how much is coming from social media and how much is coming from others, but I'd still want to know is how much of what we're saying is being heard. And then you can say, okay, from what sources? Again, just probably more unknowns than are knowns at this point. It's brand new. It changes every day. So many different platforms for using and interacting with social media also make it difficult to keep track and keep, you know, I mean, even today I was just reading in the New York Times about, you know, a new version of Outlook that Microsoft is pushing that is not, you know, not the email that I grew up with or many of us are familiar with, but it's fully integrated with social media. And that's, you know, so that's going to affect usage patterns, but it may take a while. It may be a shift as people move from one platform to another. So we're not even looking at a steady thing here. We're looking at a moving target, which is always harder to make hard and fast judgments about it. You know, again, I want to come back to the thing that I found most heartening, having had a work in the foundation before, understanding the value of the direct communication to grantees, and that is all those items we saw listed that were helpful: the face-to-face, the convenings, the program officer contacts, the site visits. I mean, by all means, if those are working, take that as a great thing and don't mess with it. That doesn't mean, and I think I heard Elizabeth say some things that were really important earlier, being more strategic in your thinking about how to get grantees to use social media, make them aware, perhaps, of what's on it and things they may be missing. So you might find them saying, we don't necessarily interact with your social media all the time, but there are things we keep your eyes on. As a funder, you know, repetition is important. Tell people what you did. I mean, tell people what you're going to do. Tell them what you did, and tell them over and over again. I spent many years in publishing and had a very good friend who sold ads, and he used to joke that he'd pitch a product, a consumer products company on a major campaign that would run over a period of, several months in the magazine. And, maybe 2 months into the campaign, he'd start getting calls from the agency saying, we're sick and tired of opening up the magazine and seeing the same ads every day. Can't we change the campaign? And his response was, hey, wait a minute. By the time you're getting sick and tired of seeing your ads, people are just recognizing and just waking up to the fact that you're even running ads in the first place. It takes time for people to see things. And again, social media is a form of communications. Don't assume just because you put it out there, you put it out there once, you put it out twice. It may take 5, 6, 7, 8 times. It may take some of the things I said earlier where, people may comment on something they saw and cite the source as being a blog, a Facebook post, a video. That might get people to say, hey, I haven't been paying attention. Maybe I will. Again, I really have to applaud Center for Effective Philanthropy for, putting these valuable pieces of findings in front of us and getting this fabulous conversation going. I just think it's way, way, way early in the game to draw any conclusions, but to do what I think, and I imagine CEP would want us to use this as a benchmark going forward and using it as a point of future conversation. So I thank you, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Bruce. Bruce, you mentioned in your remarks there are more unknowns than knowns when it comes to social media these days. So with that context in mind, there are a couple of questions that have come through that I want to ask you to give your opinion on. One is, what metrics do you recommend paying attention to for your social media?
Well, I think obviously, as I said earlier, you want to know, is anybody there? Is there anybody on the other end? Is there, if you're tweeting, you're blogging, how many followers do you have? If there are links attached to them, are people clicking through? It obviously gets more difficult to then say, but who's on the other end? I still, love that famous New Yorker cartoon of the dog sitting in the front of the computer, tapping away on the keyboard, where it says, in cyberspace, nobody knows you're a dog. So, social media is social and it's also unsocial in the sense that sometimes you could be having a conversation in a vacuum to some degree. Somebody may be reading something, somebody may be responding with an email, but it may not be a whole lot of information, with an email, but it may not be a lot of information about who that person is. We don't have the demographic information, we don't have their data attached. So, but again, you need, so I guess there's 2 things I'd say. You need to know, is there activity? Is it increasing or decreasing? Is it affected by certain things you've done? Does a report spike the level of interaction? Does a particular kind of tweet have a reaction? And then, more importantly, did the purpose you put that out there, did it have an effect on that? If you're trying to get people to take an action, was action taken? Did something happen? Because that's really all that, at the end of the day, matters in any of the communication strategies we're talking about. What do you want to have happen? What do you want to be different? What do you need to do differently to make it happen? So it's a combination of getting some sense that something's working in terms of interaction and having some way of benchmarking and measuring. And then more importantly, at the other end, is it helping the organization achieve the larger outcomes?
Great. Thank you. A tactical question that came through, Bruce. Someone wants to know, do you think it's good practice to tweet both personally and professionally using the same Twitter handle?
That's a question probably get us all in trouble if we knew. I don't know. I think it depends on the culture of your organization and what they permit. And if you're talking about tweeting personally about non-topics, then there's 2 ways of looking at it. It shows you're a human being and you have opinions besides the things you talk about at work. And then there's things you talk about topically. But I think it comes down to what the organization will permit. I do it both. I do stuff under the Com Network name, but I keep it pretty much focused and very institutional, and I don't expect a lot of back and forth on that because it's really more just getting stuff out. But there's things I do under my own name that may talk about communications related to other things that matter to me as an individual. I try to think in terms of professional terms, but it's not necessarily just about communications network activities. But I've seen, a few foundations that, and to my view, you have presidents who tweet, and I remember exchanging one about the fact, that I just bought my iPad with a foundation president who happened to be tweeting on a Sunday afternoon as I was waiting on line at an Apple store and said, look at me. So, I think you have to take some chances occasionally, do things that you think are appropriate, see what happens.
Great. Elizabeth, do you have a perspective on that about tweeting both personally and professionally using the same Twitter handle?
Yeah, definitely. And this is something that comes up with our staff a lot, people who are newer to Twitter. I mean, I think it's good to do. I think you need to be smart about it and remember and, develop a social media policy if it makes sense for your organization. But know that what you say on Twitter is public, and it's essentially, and so we say this to individuals too, be smart about what you tweet. Obviously, you're allowed to have a personality. If you work for Knight Foundation and you're interested in everything that we're funding, which clearly you are, then by all means share our content, interact with grantees. We think of our program staff who are on Twitter as a huge asset to us because they answer questions individually. They put a face to the foundation, so it's not just Knight Foundation's main Twitter feed, which, yeah, it's great that we have 30,000 followers, but the foundation is also the people who work there. So we encourage staff to tweet. We just give them guidelines and say, be smart about it. These are the kinds of things you should avoid. These are the kinds of things, but we do let people do that, and we think it's a big asset.
So Elizabeth, a couple of questions that have come in for you. How many people are in the communications department at Knight Foundation, and do you think there's a correlation between having larger communications department and having more advanced use of social media?
So there are 6 of us total. On the Knight Foundation's communications team. My position, I came to Knight about a year ago, and my position was new. So and another position was added about a year and a half ago. So it's grown from 4 to 6 in the past sort of year and a half. I mean, I think the answer to that is probably yes. I think it speaks to an enhanced capacity for somebody to manage social media, and that really speaks to the the consistency. It's one, and I thought of this when looking through the report. It's one thing for a foundation to say, yes, we have Twitter. It's totally different if you haven't updated it in 2 weeks. So really consistency is key, and clearly that takes time and resources for somebody who can do that. For Knight Foundation, that really came to us. We went through a website redesign about a year ago, and once that was complete, we really felt like we had the channels, we had the site to be able to share this content and manage more interaction and engagement. So we needed, they brought somebody on who could help increase capacity for doing that.
And following that, Elizabeth, questions come through about the type of investment that's required to really engage in having a social media presence, and whether or not you really need a designated staff person for that. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think you need organizational. I think one of the first things before you even ask yourself about having a designated person is, do you have organizational buy-in? Do you have people who are willing, who think Twitter is a great idea? Do you have people who are willing to blog? People who want to create this content as a way to engage with people. So does it have to be just one person? Definitely not. I mean, I think ideally you're getting this content from a lot of different places, and if you have people, you have program staff who are willing to do Google Hangouts, office hours, that's great. That's ideal, because as I said, the foundation is made up of the people who work there, and your success will be based on sort of how much the staff is able to help the communications and its goals. And I'll say that I don't think any of Knight's sort of social media success or experimentation would be possible without that. And I think it's really gone a long way in opening up the channels of communication between our communications department and our program staff. I think that's been really key to sort of our ability to experiment.
Bruce, could you talk a little bit about your thoughts for smaller foundations? There's a question here about, with smaller foundations, is it better to make use of individual staff members' social media presence than creating a foundation organizational presence? Do you have thoughts on that?
Again, I'm probably going to sound like I'm repeating myself, but it all starts with what does the organization want to accomplish, and I'm presuming built into that question is one that's already been answered, is that what do we as a foundation overall want to accomplish, and how will communications get us there? I mean, if you look at Twitter or any of this just strictly tactically, then that's all it is. You're just putting stuff out there because you think you need to be doing it. But if you're making a judgment up front that we believe that we can be more successful as an organization if we invest in communications for a specific purpose, and it's going to help us achieve our goals more effectively, more quickly, any number of reasons, and there's a role for Twitter to play, then you're back into it saying, okay, now it's a capacity issue, and you know, it's more tactical than strategic, because we know we want to use Twitter to get certain messages out. We hope they're read by certain people. We think we want to link to specific information, or we want to get conversations going on specific topics. But once you know the why, the what follows.
Okay. Elizabeth, do you know what percentage of your grantees follow the Knight Foundation on Facebook and on Twitter?
You know, so I should have said this before, the report that CEP put out does not include Knight Foundation grantees. And we have done a survey of our own grantees, and we are getting the results of those back in, and that's something that we are hoping that we can share more widely in the fall, because it's something we're really interested in knowing, specifically around our grantees, the ones that are really active in journalism and media innovation. We want to know to what extent you know, they're using our social media. So stay tuned.
Okay. There's a related question that came through for CEP, which I'll answer. Someone asked if we can share the names of the 34 foundations that were part of this research, and that's not information that we can share. The foundations whose grantees filled out this survey did not agree to be named as a part of this research. One other question for you, Elizabeth. Does the Knight Foundation tweet or post to Facebook on weekends?
We do. We, you know, I'll say that we are active on social media. I wouldn't say 24 hours a day, but we are pretty active. One of the things we noticed from looking at our analytics and from some experimentation is that we have a big audience on the West Coast. And so even though we're based in Miami and some of our days end at 6 o'clock, that's only 3 o'clock on the East Coast. So, you know, there are ways. So the answer is yes, we do post to Google+, Facebook, and Twitter on nights and weekends. But there are a lot of great scheduling tools, so you may not have to be at the computer at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning to push the button. You can schedule it a day or two in advance. But yes, we do.
Okay.
And actually, just quickly, I'll say that one of the other things we look at is there are a lot of studies on what times of day people are most active and most likely to see your content. And Facebook in particular has a higher level of engagement on weekends. So we've been playing around with that also.
Very interesting. Andrea, a question about some of the findings. Did we see a relationship in the data between the frequency of foundations using the various social media tools that we examined and the proportion of their grantees that were following or reading or engaging with them?
Great. And as I said, there was definitely a variation in the frequency of use of foundations using their social media tools. However, we did not see a relationship between how frequently they were using their social media and what proportion of the grantees were engaging in their social media. And of course, you know, a few things to add to that. There's so few grantees who are actually using their social media, so that could be a potential reason. Something else that it raised for us that we don't have data on is maybe it's more related to the content of those posts.
Another question that came in about the data, Andrea. So almost a third of grantees surveyed did not know whether their funder or their funder staff used social media, and the question arises then, is this about who we surveyed at the grantee organization? Does that quote-unquote handicap the findings of this research?
Yes, and so as I shared, the respondents occupy a variety of positions at the grantee organizations. And we contacted them, or we surveyed them, because they were designated by the foundations in this research as the primary contact for that foundation. And so I think we see them, if the foundation designated them as a primary contact, as a very perfect audience for foundation social media. And again, I would actually ask Elizabeth if she wanted to comment about how she communicates to the grantees about their availability of these resources that the Knight Foundation has.
Sure. So that's something that we're actually thinking a lot more about. We have a part of our site called knightcommunications.org, and that is a site that we send to everyone who becomes a Knight Foundation grantee. It's public, so anyone can go look at it actually, and it has a variety of resources on it. It has things about how to draft a press release, tools that might have, like how to, just simple things like here's our logo, this is how you should use it if you need it for materials. But it's also like, we've integrated like buttons and tweet buttons into every page of our site, so it's always at the top of every blog post. It's on every whatever page of our site you're on. It's always very prominent, and so. If that's something that we want to do a better job of being more systematic about, and I gave the example of integrating staff's Twitter handles onto their bio pages. So I think it's a variety, and that's something that we hope the research that we're doing around how our grantees are interacting with us on social media, we'll see to what extent we've been successful and how we can improve upon it.
One more question for you, Elizabeth, and I have an additional question for you, Bruce, but before we wrap up. Elizabeth, could you talk a bit about tools that are available to manage multiple social media platforms?
Sure. So this is also a challenge that we face in that, when we are sending things out, are we posting the same thing on Twitter that we're posting on Facebook? And we actually haven't really been doing that because we found more success when we write differently for different audiences. So on Twitter, we're using hashtags. On Facebook, we're uploading video and using photos and trying to be a little bit more interactive and dynamic. So the challenge in terms of tracking that is that you're looking at all these different tools. You're looking at Facebook Insights. You're looking at Google Analytics. You're looking at Bitly to sort of to get this full picture. And that's been a struggle for us. And I think a new tool that I'm sort of playing around with right now that's in beta is called SparkWise. And that allows you to sort of group all of those things that I just mentioned together. And it also includes things like Google News, so you can see if you have press mentions, in the last couple of days. So we've just sort of been playing around with that to sort of see if that's going to sort of solve the problem of going to 20 different places to get a big picture of what's going on.
Thank you. And Bruce, a final question for you. Some requests for trainings regarding using social media that might be available to those on the line.
That's a good question. I get asked that a lot, and I think occasionally I've seen examples of regional associations holding events for their members. Organizations like the Council on Foundations has been kicking around doing training even for their next annual conference. We at our own conference in Seattle have a skill building session that's looking specifically at how foundations can use social media more effectively. It's not something I personally track. I would actually defer to someone like Elizabeth, and she may even have ideas of where people can look.
Elizabeth, do you have any ideas?
No, I'm actually sort of thinking that this would be a really good follow-up blog post because there does seem to be a lot of interest in the topic, and rather than sort of, it wasn't something I was prepared to talk about, so if I could sort of take a little bit more time and sort of do that as a follow-up, I think I'll be able to give people a clearer picture.
Great, thank you. And just a follow-up question for you, Elizabeth. Someone on the line didn't quite hear the name of the beta program that you mentioned. Could you repeat the name?
Sure. It's called SparkWise. It's SPARKWISE. rkwi.se, Sparkwise.
Thank you.
And I'll mention that in my follow-up blog post as well.
Thank you. Okay, well, I realize there are a number of questions that we did not have time to get to today, so I do apologize to those of you who submitted questions that we did not address. And although this concludes our webinar, it hopefully does not conclude the conversation that's happening about this issue. So please do feel free to take a look at CEP's blog for some guest posts we added in recent days about foundations and grantees in social media. We'll have more posts coming in the coming days from Bruce and from Elizabeth, so please feel free to comment on our blog or via Twitter. A special thank you to Bruce and Elizabeth for joining us today, to Andrea for sharing the research with us, and to the Rita Allen Foundation for supporting this project, and of course to all of you for participating on this call. We'll be sending out a link to the webinar in the coming days, and we'll make the PowerPoint available. The research report that Andrea presented about is available for download on our website for free. CEP's website is www.effectivephilanthropy.org. And if you have any other questions or would like any more information about our research, please feel free to contact us. Thank you all, and have a good rest of your afternoon.